I love watching liberals talk about this without identifying what the problem is. Because at the end of the day, you just go back to, well, they're cheating because their system's design is better than ours. But they will never admit that because then they would have to take the L on capitalism. Because that's what it comes down to. I will say it's, not lost on me that virtually all of the liberals who used to say China's going to fail next year, China's collapse is imminent, all those liberals are now making, China is actually dominating us style videos. I'm saying it. Thrilled that Ezra Klein. Oh, that's why. That's where this is coming from. Brad Setzer, CFR senior fellow, went on Ezra Klein's podcast, The China Shock 2.0, and I guess explained Trump's thinking. That makes sense. Explained Trump's... It's so funny. These guys all used to get mad at Donald Trump for taking this militant trade posture against China. And now every single one of these people are just like, no, Trump is actually not doing the wrong thing against China. It's actually a good idea. Yes, Trump does have a unique trade design, chatters. So there is thinking driving, there is something motivating Trump's decisions against China. It's just, it's a failure. It's just, it failed. That's the problem. Do you understand? I know it's fun to say Trump's thinking about burgers. Trump doesn't think. Yes, you're right. But there is definitely a different attitude with Trump's trade policy and trade posture against China versus the previous American trade policy with respect to China. Okay? And I guess this CFR fellow went on Ezra Klein and explained the second China shock, its causes, its consequences, including for American workers. It wouldn't be called against China, but it would be effectively... Do we have a video? I would love to watch that video, by the way. Does Ezra not want you on? No, he does. We're going to link up.
In the world right now is China's growing dominance across advanced manufacturing sector after advanced manufacturing sector. From electric vehicles, batteries, to solar panels, to things that aren't even traditional manufacturing, that are software like AI and open models, where they become a world leader. What is happening here is very different than what we call the first China shock, where China became a big exporter, but of things that were not that important to advanced economies, things that mattered maybe for particular communities, mattered for many, many jobs, but weren't the frontier of economic growth. But now it's different. China is very much at the frontier and they're dominating it. And that is going to transform geopolitics. It is going to transform the politics of countries, many say in Europe, where China is pushing them out of manufacturing that has been the absolute cornerstone of their economies. And so I think understanding it is about as...
Dude, Ezra Klein is, by my estimations, much more interested in movements on the left, even if it's to co-opt it, even if it's to liberalize it, it doesn't matter. I think there's a real opportunity, and I know people will always, you guys hate him, I know. But I put Ezra Klein in the same category as I put the Pod Johns. Perhaps I'm wrong about this, but that's my assessment.
Essential to understanding economics and geopolitics in the coming era, as literally anything is.
I also am an unashamed, unapologetic Ezra Klein watcher, Ezra Klein reader. It's very important to understand a leading thinker of liberalism. Okay, he's the king of the libs. Let's be real. It's important to understand where liberals are going. We used to jokingly watch SNL every Sunday. Why did we watch it? Because we wanted to understand how liberals think, what liberals laugh at, what motivates liberals. He is the king of the liberal intelligentsia. And it's really important when the king of liberal intelligentsia turns around and says stuff like, Mamdani would be just like any other liberal mayor. He's not actually talking about Andrew Cuomo. He's saying other liberal mayors would do similar things, Mamdani. I disagree with him on that, but it doesn't matter. He's trying to take ownership over the left flank and then say, no, this is what liberalism as a big tent looks like. Okay?
Brad Setzer is a person who follows us about as closely as anyone on Earth. He is a senior fellow at the Council of Foreign Relations. He has served in top trade roles and economic roles in the Biden and Obama administrations. And so I wanted to hear his perspective on it. He joins me now. Brad Setzer, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks for inviting me.
So you've been arguing that the world economy is going through a China shock 2.0.
I mean, okay, right off the rip, I don't even disagree with this assessment. It is true. It is true. China is the domineering manufacturing power of the entire planet. It's the manufacturing hub of the entire planet. And it's no longer just like light industries or Forever 21 fast fashion clothing. It's also very important industries that in the past were kept for national security concerns in the hands of domestic manufacturing. We allowed this to happen. And yes, this is a very important point of leverage for China. It's a very important point of leverage for China. Okay? And it also complicates the rest of the world's relationship with China. Because if we don't have any domestic manufacturing, and China is always capable of outcompeting us in terms of manufacturing, okay, shouts out the NAFTA, shouts out the neoliberalism for that, by the way. But if we don't have any sort of domestic manufacturing, we have nothing. It's not even just like a national security problem at that point. It's a major issue overall. Okay? Because then we're just not producing anything. We don't have any jobs.
So for people not familiar with this, what was China Shock 1.0?
2002. What happens is there's a big jump up in China's exports. And at the time, it's mostly in relatively low-end manufactured goods, furniture, household appliances, clothing. And I think there was a sense in the U.S. that these were not the industries of the future. And I think what the China Shock 1.0 academic literature shows is that even though these weren't the industries of the future, they were still employing a meaningful number of Americans, often in the South, often in the Midwest. And the China shock is how that impacted local, not national, local labor markets that had the most overlap with China. And this has sort of a short-run negative effect on parts of the economy. You know, when the local factory closes down, local real estate prices turn down. And so, and the people who sell lunches to the factory workers have fewer people to sell to. So it becomes a generalized downturn in those communities. That was clearly underestimated. And then people have done all sorts of further studies which correlate the areas that have the most exposure to the Chinese export wave, to, deaths of despair, to political realignments.
Voting for Donald Trump.
But
the basic idea here is that you have a bunch of places in the Midwest and the South primarily that are manufacturing towns, that their factories are outsourced to China or the goods are outcompeted by China, and basically the community goes into sharp decline.
Correct.
And we never have a very good policy answer.
I mean, I think at the time we didn't even try to have a policy answer, but it is actually conceptually difficult to deal with the decline of a small town when it's big industry.
Let's live in that debate for a minute. What is the argument about whether or not this rapidly accelerating level of trade with China is good or bad for America?
Yes, I have a wig on. I have a toupee.
I think the overarching view at the time was that China's integration into the global economy was more or less inevitable, and that the negotiated terms of entry into the WTO provided a reasonable framework for China's full integration into the global economy, that trade was fundamentally good, that there would be shifts across industries. People would leave their jobs and import competing parts of the economy, but generally move to exporting parts of the economy or into the services sector, and that we had a fairly flexible labor market. And by the way, integration would be a positive force for China's political development. It might lead to some forms of liberalism within China. It might moderate China's global ambitions. It would sort of the commerce would tame the dragon, so to speak.
And the other dimension of the argument, as I've heard it and remember it, is if China wants to make cheap goods for Americans, people like low prices, they like low inflation. Like, why would we fight this gift?
I mean, in particular, because the industries that were going to China were not the source of top, cutting edge technology at the time, not generating a lot of high wage jobs. So there was indeed a sense that, consumers would benefit and did benefit from cheap goods. And the adjustment would not threaten the core strengths of the American economy. I think that was the belief. I would put a little tiny asterisk around the cheap prices thing. Unambiguously, China's explosion of exports lowered the price of manufacturers. If you look at the overall evolution of consumer prices during this period, there's not much of a change. China's integration into the world economy led in huge amounts of investment, ended up putting a lot of upward pressure on commodity prices. So you see oil prices really take off during this period, and that's an offsetting change. So, you got to always look at both sides of the ledger.
Yeah, so when you're going to Target or Walmart and you're buying clothes and toys, I mean, they really are cheaper.
Oh, yeah.
Like in real terms from when I was a kid. But you're saying that, what we're not seeing there is, the price of oil, the price of...
It costs you more to fill up your car to get to Target. But once you got to Target, it was cheap.
Okay, so China shock, the reason we use this term is...
It's so funny because, this was America's grand trade design because it benefited the goals of American capital. It benefited the short-term goals of American capital because labor is the most malleable aspect of production, and it's the only movable aspect of production. And therefore, the easiest way to reduce labor costs was to move it instead of engaging in suppression of unionization, which we were doing, right? Which American capital had never let up on. They were able to move it to an entirely separate, low-cost labor force altogether. And the problem, and this has always been the biggest issue with China in general, is that China, by way of redistributive policies and through central planning, right, the small c communism of China, was able to take that foreign investment and turn it into internal development. The issue with China is that China developed and became a competitive power and gained sovereignty, okay? Or always was invested in developing sovereignty for itself. That's the issue that we have with China. That's the problem with the grand China design. If China developed in the same way that India developed, we would have no issues with China. No disrespect to India. Obviously, it's a different story. It's much more complex. But the reason why we hate China and see China as a foreign adversary is not even because of the ideological battle that we have with China. That's secondary. The real issue with China is that China was able to take the foreign investment and not circulate the foreign investment in the same way that capitalist countries do. India literally has similar levels of economic planning. No, India is far too diverse, wasn't capable of dealing with, or wasn't as invested in even development in the same way. To say that India has the same level of central planning is crazy. India also has separate issues that were greatly elevated initially by colonial powers. It's not a one-to-one comparison. It is a very reductive comparison. Okay? It's not it's not an appropriate comparison. I'm just looking at it specifically from the perspective of like what's that guy's name? The Noah guy, No Opinion. Like, he loves India. He always presents India as this bulwark against China and a much better alternative. Like, I'm just flipping that script on its head. And it's not like China did not liberalize. They did. But even through the marketization period, even through the liberalization of the Chinese economy after the, Dengis reforms, there was always still a hyper focus on development, and especially in the Xi period, now they're cracking down on some of the concentration of power that exists within the party system after they brought in the billionaire class. They developed the billionaire class, the national bourgeois, as they call it, and then they basically stamped out some of the national bourgeois that had maybe a little bit too much power. Okay? So there's a push and pull there, and China, for all intents and purposes, has been able to manage that friction and has kept capital under control. India never did. Also, the Indian history of colonialism is different than China as well. Like, that's why it's not a direct comparison that you can make. Yeah, China was never completely colonized, but again, ultimately, the major difference between China and India is capital controls. Okay? That is the main function of the government and the main difference between the government. The only reason why people still in some way, shape, or form, still consider the Chinese governance to be a version of some level of proletarian governance, regardless of the repression, regardless of the Marxist-Leninist formation, one-party state, one-party communist state, is because at the end of the day, there is still some level of control over both flows of capital and control over the capitalists, okay? They still serve the interests of the party, and the party is supposed to serve the interests of the masses. That is a huge difference. That's a major difference in Chinese development as opposed to development in India. And that is the major difference as to why we see India as a reliable trade partner and ally at times, even though they have their own sovereign interests in the region. They have their own sovereign interests as an economic power. They play both sides with, like, Russia, for example. As opposed to in China, we see China as a major foreign adversary, if not the most consequential foreign adversary of the 21st century. It's because China took all of that foreign investment, right? And that foreign investment came into China. And then what they did with that foreign investment was to develop the country and make it a behemoth, a competitive superpower. In some respects, if you were to look at this as global capitalism, the capital-owning class, the bourgeois class in China, is still beholden to the interests of the party, is still subservient to the interests of the party, okay? As opposed to the Indian capitalist class is a part of the global capitalist class. So they play ball. They're not unpredictable. They're not a force that, like a French capitalist is ever going to be fearful of. Does that make sense? And if it wasn't for Xi Jinping, by my estimation, if the party had moved in the opposite direction and continued liberalizing, the Chinese capital class, the Chinese bourgeois, would probably also be in the same category. And therefore, we would not be looking at China as this scary behemoth as we do right now. Because it's not just about improving the living standards of as many Chinese people as possible. It's also about whether or not our international capitalist class can look at the Chinese capital owning class and see them as allies. The problem, at least from my assessment, is that is the element of I guess nationalism. It's a scary word. It's a dangerous word. It's not entirely correct to say that the Chinese bourgeois class are nationalists, but it is a national bourgeois class to a certain degree. So is the connective tissue communism, or is the connective tissue there nationalism? That's where things get a little bit more tricky. But the reason why China was allowed into the World Trade Organization, the reason why China was allowed to participate in the global market, in the global markets as a regular force, as a regular manufacturing hub, initially was because of that liberalization. Because that liberalization created this major force within Chinese politics that was then brought into the party, right? Hu Jintao, and that these folks, the Chinese bourgeois, were now a part of the party apparatus, and they were gaining a lot of power within the party until Xi Jinping. That's why if you look back at China from the perspective of our capitalist media, from the perspective of our capital owning class, if you go back to like the 2000s, our media are super wealthy. They didn't see China as this like major threat at all. I mean, there were obviously nationalist elements in the country that did. Because, there are plenty of people who have been complaining about Chinese manufacturing for decades at this point. Initially, it was the left, and then it turned into somewhat of a right-wing position. Trade protectionism has moved from the left to a right-wing position at this point in some weird ways. There are still elements of the left that engage in trade protectionism. I believe in trade protectionism as well, as long as we have some kind of trade to protect. But this is the reason why we see China as a major threat.
That this whole argument got reevaluated. And so which parts of it would you say panned out and which didn't?
I think the extent to which China would become a big export market was overestimated. China never was fully open to U.S. exports. I mean, one of the more striking things is that after 2004, so 2 years after China's WTO entry, China's imports as a share of its GDP start to fall. And then it was not expected, in a sense, that China would succeed as much as it did while retaining the core aspects of its different economic system. There was the sense that China would have to converge, have to become more like...
It's so funny because he's basically describing the exact same thing that I tried to also shittily describe.
Us. Maybe politically, but certainly economically. The state would wither away, state-owned enterprises would be privatized. 20 years after China joined the WTO, China's economy was, the thinking was it would kind of look like the U.S. or maybe look like Europe. It wouldn't be distinctively Chinese, and that didn't pan out.
What is distinctively Chinese about the Chinese economy?
That's a hard question.
No, it's not. It is small c communist. That's what's distinct about the Chinese economy. It still has central planning, although it's not central planning in the Soviet understanding of it. Okay? It's not centrally planned in the way that you would see as this like vulgar Soviet meta. It's not centrally planned in the way that the Cuban economy is centrally planned. It's much more dynamic. Okay? But ultimately, capital is subservient to the party. Capital is subservient to the government, and the government is run by a party that is supposed to be subservient to the interests of the proletariat. Okay? If you want the honest assessment of it, that's what it is. Cuba isn't centrally planned anymore. No, I'm not talking about Cuba now, brother. I'm talking about Cuba for the longest time Cuba for the longest time was literally the last remaining real Soviet-style economy on the planet, okay? Like down to rations, down to like the specific allotment of food that you could get. Like, that was a USSR-style economy. The Chinese economy is much more fluid, much more dynamic than that. However, as I like to say, China uses capitalism like a sleeve. Okay? If they have an iron fist, they put the sleeve of capitalism over that iron fist. Okay? Where ultimately there are strict controls. It's still a centrally planned economy. And the way that the central planned economy is designed is around control of capital flows. Okay? They still absolutely control which way they will pour money into. There's also obviously, yes, corporate accountability and things like that. But ultimately, they even allow some level of corruption or some level of exploitation as long as that means boosting trade, as long as that means improving the GDP. So they are just state capitalists. One could say all socialist formations run by communist governments have always been state capitalist. The whole point is it's a transitional socialist state.
Open the door, man.
Yeah, I did. One thing that is distinctly Chinese, which is not what you would normally think about in a communist-led society, is that China actually has a rather thin system of social insurance. It doesn't actually collect that much tax. Personal income tax collections are like 1% of China's GDP. It's 8% here. If you're not collecting personal income tax, you're not going to have the resources to be very generous in helping, low-wage work. There's nothing like our earned income tax credit where you get a subsidy, basically, money back from the government if you don't get paid that much. The taxation system relies heavily on taxes on consumption. It's really quite regressive. It hits poor Chinese workers much more heavily. It also does not have a unified national.
He's not wrong. This is not wrong. Yes, their tax structure, they have a welfare state, but it is marginal. It doesn't mean that their system is failing, mind you, but he's not wrong. And this isn't to say that welfareism is the only solution. I'm just saying it's a different system.
Labor market. The so-called hukou system basically means, you're supposed to work where you were born. You can migrate and leave, but when you migrate and leave, you give up certain social rights. You got a financial system that is fundamental.
Yes, it's not necessarily a robust welfare state, but there are a lot of social provisions that you get as long as you stay within the area. When this used to be far more rigorous back in the day. It's not as stringent. It's not as strict. It is nowhere near as strict as it used to be. But yes, in a central planned economy, the original Chinese system had strict controls over, internal freedom of movement. Not necessarily freedom of movement, but just moving and living and working in a different area in general. Obviously, that wasn't always the case because they also are very experimental and have always been very experimental. I think one of the most unique facets of Chinese development and Chinese governance is how they treat, because they're so big, they're such a massive country, 1.4 billion people, that they treat different provinces like different laboratories. There's constant, it's very fluid. There's constant experimentation going on. And the hukou system has been reformed. But basically, what it currently operates as is, let's say you are born in California and you grew up in California, you went to school in California, and the school is paid for by California state taxes, not your local tax, not your property taxes. And all of the amenities are paid for by the state taxes. If you were to move from California to New York, there's a process where you have to apply. And there are restrictions. You can move to New York. You can visit New York. You can even live in New York, but you won't be able to get the same free healthcare, for example, that you would get in California. Now in America, we don't even have free healthcare, so it doesn't matter. But that's what the current form the current form of the hukou system works as. You can go and live wherever you want in China. You can work wherever you want in China. It's just you won't have the same social benefits that you would have in the state that you or the province that you were born into. One version of the hukou system in America, if you want to call it that, is kind of like in-state tuition versus out-of-state tuition. Right? We don't really have additional amenities in our welfare state, so it's hard to make this comparison, and college is expensive regardless of whether you're paying in-state tuition or not, but that is one version of the American hukou system. That's what's so fascinating about it, that Americans will be like, what the f***, that's crazy. They're just like, they'll kill you if you move away from your state. That's not the case.
Mentally state-controlled, heavily banked. Not so much, like the Wall Street part of the Chinese economy exists, but it's much smaller. The old-fashioned put your money on deposit in a state bank, very much the dominant mode of savings, and then the state banks intermediate so they can direct credit towards the goals of the party, towards the goals of the government, sometimes under the direction of the local government, sometimes under the direction of the national government. The commanding heights of the Chinese economy are still primarily in the hands of centrally owned state-owned enterprises. So this is, why it's sometimes difficult to sell to China. You want to sell soybeans. Actually, you have to...
But that's a state incentive, not a federal incentive. Why would China encourage people not to move? Keeping an industrial labor force in certain areas in the country by incentivizing them to stay at home? Like, what do you mean? Think about how cities develop. The hukou system has always been very porous anyway. Back in the day, people would just pay off a couple of officials and get their kids in a better school in another area, for example. My parents did that for me. Lol, the bride was just a couple hundred yuan. There's also a lot of testing, as I said. It's like a laboratory of governance, like different forms of governance, different modes of developing the economy. And you need people for that. In the United States of America, there's like freedom of travel, but then again, we don't really have a functioning welfare state anyway, so people make those decisions on their own. Like, for example, you got Medi-Cal, but you could technically move to a state like Wisconsin where there's Badger Care, but it's much more restrictive than Medi-Cal, right? So technically, that's a version of the hukou system. If you're moving to Wisconsin, which is a lower cost site, a lower cost state in general, but all of a sudden, or you move to Texas where you're not paying income tax as you would in the state of California, but now you're paying much higher property taxes. So that's just that's like one version of, I guess, the upside down hukou system.
Generally sell to the state oilseeds monopoly. You're not selling to an individual soybean crusher. Selling airplanes to China. You're selling to the big three state airlines who act as a coordinated block. Telecommunications, you're selling to 3 state-owned companies whose executives are picked by the party, who take direction centrally. And then on top of that, when the government sets a policy direction, say we want to have a semiconductor industry, ambitious provinces will say, well, we should be the province that builds up China's national champion. Here's an ambitious guy or girl. Looks like they got a good idea. Here's a whole bunch of money. We're going to subsidize your factory. Maybe we're going to take equity. We're going to make sure you get bank loans. And so a whole bunch of different firms spring up in that sector with support, and they start competing very intensely. So it's, a mix of state-directed and intensely competitive.
I want to draw something out in that description, which I thought was great.
Is it affected by family relations? Guys, no, it doesn't work that way anymore. You can't just you're not region locked in China any longer, okay? I'm talking about one of the most back in the day when the country was developing, it was far more restrictive. The hukou system itself now exists as as the way I explained it to you. Like you can go to a different province. You can work in a different province. Many people do. A lot of people do actually in China. Ironically enough, because of the youth unemployment crisis, many youths are actually going back to the rural countryside, which is developing at a much more rapid pace now, and trying to work factory jobs more than ever before. Another aspect of hukou is land rights for rural Chinese. Land reform gave land to rural farmers and the right to live in big cities without everyone piling in on one city. Yes. Because remember, through the growth period, post-revolution, through the growth period in China, even with Dengist reforms, before Dengist reforms, but certainly after Dengist reforms as well, there is rapid industrialization taking place. There's rapid urbanization taking place, but it's not even. They are always trying to get to even development, but of course it's not going to be even development because you have the countryside that's massive, right? And they're obviously always going to be, they're obviously always going to fall behind the major cities. So then, in an effort to make sure that the rural side, the countryside is also, the rural side is also industrializing, or the rural side is also developing, they have to keep people there. You get social insurance when you work now. The hukou system isn't entirely defunct, but it's mostly been decoupled from social insurance. Yeah.
How their economy is different. China has gotten a lot richer, and less of that wealth than you might have thought has gone into things like a universal healthcare system, a social insurance system for the elderly. America got richer. We built Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, welfare, earned income tax credit, child tax credit. China's gotten richer because it has not allowed a lot of that, because also you have such power over the financial system. It has just been able to move much more of that money into subsidized.
I love hearing liberals react in awe to the power of a centrally planned economy. Okay? Because, like, look, every economy on the planet is a mixed. Every economy on the planet is a mixed economy. Okay? There is some capitalist elements in everyone, and then there's socialist elements in every single one. Okay? Obviously, social democracy is still a capitalist formation because capital owners still get to make decisions decoupled from the rest of society, and sometimes actually capital owners make decisions that are antithetical to the needs or antagonistic to the needs of the working class in their countries. They don't have any sort of like national ambition. Okay? I guess the truest sense of capitalism would be something as decentralized as Somalia, or maybe I guess like the current formation in Argentina. But even then, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But there are obviously higher degrees of socialization in Nordic countries as opposed to the United States of America, but there's still some level of socialization. The problem is with China, we treat it like they're cheating. Why are they cheating? Well, because they have subsidies on steroids. They deploy state subsidies to make their production more competitive, to artificially reduce costs, to make sure that they have plentiful, cheap alternatives, much more cost-effective alternatives to whatever Europe is manufacturing. The other problem with China is that their cost-effective alternatives are now also better, technologically better than our domestic manufacturing. At least back in the day, when Chinese commodities were talked about, we were like, oh, it's cheap, it's just shitty. Like I remember, I was born in 1991, right? I'm old, I'm 35. But I remember like leading into the 2000s, the idea, the trend was that, Chinese goods are shitty. They're nowhere near as good as stuff made in Europe, right? A lot of Zoomers do not understand that was the outlook. Okay? That was the outlook. Nowadays, people don't say that no more. And it's ironic because while, still some people believe that and it's wrong, what matters not is how people approach the subject. What matters is what the reality is. And if you look at business owners, for example, now American titans of industry will look to Chinese commodities and Chinese cars, like EV, for example, and they look at it in admiration. They say, like, if these cars were to come into the American market, they would destroy us. We'd never be able to sell another car again. That was Farley. What's his name? The CEO of Ford, who went to China, and his daily driver is a Chinese car, who straight up came back to America, the Ford CEO, and said, if Chinese vehicles were to enter the American market, we would never be able to sell another car ever again. Back in the day, they also used to say, oh, China is stealing our IP. He briefly mentioned this as well, right? That was a handshake agreement. It's not like American capital owners were oblivious to the fact that the Chinese manufacturers were also taking our IP, our patents, and recreating them, like cheaper alternatives to it. We knew, and we still know to this day. It's not like they're delusional. That was absolutely a handshake agreement from American capital. You get to manufacture our goods. We get to displace our labor. We get to, manufacture our goods in your factories, and you get to, take the patents and make the exact same cheap alternative and slap a Chinese sticker on it. Nowadays, that's not even happening. Nowadays, the Chinese innovation has actually gained a stronger foothold, where Americans are purchasing Chinese goods to try to retool their vehicles with the Chinese bells and whistles. We're stealing from them. Not that it matters, because we will never have a competitive edge in manufacturing, because we've destroyed our productive capabilities. And therefore, in order to rebuild domestic manufacturing, we would have to spend decades. This is decades of training, decades of proficiency. Chinese manufacturing is superior to the American manufacturing, as Tim Cook openly admits, because they have decades of experience as well. High precision manufacturing is not easy to recreate.
Production innovation in like new economic areas it wants to dominate.
The basic retirement benefit that anyone in China gets, no matter what your residency status, is like tens of dollars a month. It's really, really trivial. The health insurance system, people aren't confident that when they walk into the hospital that the costs will be covered, and frequently there's a lot of upfront payments. And some people also say the one-child policy in an incredibly competitive marriage market has made it, a requirement for young men to save if they want to get married. All this has produced an economy that just saves an incredible share of its national income, over 40% of GDP, uniquely high. And that means the state financial sector is just flush with money. So part of it is that China has the capacity to direct investment through the state. Part of it is just it can finance out of its own.
This is not entirely true as well. As far as the only aspect of this that's true is the savings side. He's not wrong about that. China is a saving nation. America, on the other hand, is a nation in debt. China is the exact opposite. And the only other thing that I would point to that he's not entirely correct on, but he's not entirely wrong on, is the healthcare system. Because healthcare is an area that needs a lot of improvement in China. This is true. So it's still state-run, but it is one aspect of it is one it is one area where they have to improve dramatically, and they are improving.
Savings, levels of investment that no other country has matched.
All right, so I think this is all true through China Shock 1.0. Mm-hmm. The view is maybe more of it would change as time went on, but it didn't. So what is China Shock 2.0? When do you date it? How do you describe it?
So I date the start of China Shock 2.0 to the collapse of China's property market in 2021. Now, we all know there was an awful lot going on in 2020, the pandemic. Xi gets concerned that there's too much investment in property, probably rightly so, that there were empty buildings piling up. He introduces a policy, 3 red lines, which sort of restricts finance for the property sector, and it succeeds too well. And the property market basically tanks. And then in order to offset the economic impact of this fall, she more or less gives the banking system guidance to lend, to finance a new wave of manufacturing investment, and particularly manufacturing in more cutting-edge sectors. So electric vehicles being the leading example. But in general, it's investment in any sector where China has import dependence. And for Xi, that's a vulnerability. And so he really directs the state's financial sector and, the party to throw money into building out sectors where China has an import dependence. The effect is China moves back to growing on the back of net exports. China's domestic economy is growing 3-4%. So, you're getting 1.5 to 2 percentage points of growth from net exports. That's a lot of statistics, but what it basically means is China is exporting a ton of cars. China is supplying the entire world with batteries. China is now the leading exporter of tunnel boring machines.
True.
You name the category of machinery, China's exports are growing. It's no longer just consumer electronics. So China starts getting growth, big part of its growth, from an expanding trade surplus. Imports stop growing. This is, I think one of the key factors around the second China shock. Normally, you would say imports would grow with domestic demand. Chinese imports.
The reality of the matter is, the reason why we say China's cheating is because they are capable of, due to centrally planned, central control and centrally planned economy, due to their centrally planned economy, they're able to do what I like to call like nuclear levels of subsidies. And they also have complete control over how those subsidies are utilized, as opposed to in the United States of America, when we offer subsidies, some of that goes to price control. It's a crude way to look at it. But much of that still goes back to executive salaries and improving shareholder value. That's it. So we look at it and we go, that's cheating. You're cheating. They're not cheating. We're just not competing with them appropriately. And then we're calling it cheating. What is this? Dog, did you just send me? Wait, this is from August 27th, 2025. This is a Taylor Lorenz article about Chorus from a year ago, like exactly a year ago, that was very controversial at the time. That's so funny that you're posting that right now, saying David Pacman caught. That's hilarious.
Exports basically aren't growing. And in key sectors,
China is selling ever more to the world.
and
but
then
it is
Chinese
not
export.
buying more from
And ultimately, look, they are, a version of this is what Amazon does, right? Like at a more localized scale, at the domestic scale, this is kind of what Amazon does, right? It's called predatory pricing, right? Amazon, due to its tremendous industrial capabilities, due to the fact that it owns the marketplace and can create much more cost-effective forms of the same exact things that are selling well on its own marketplace, they can artificially cut prices, right? And outcompete other, smaller businesses that are relying on their marketplace. Okay? So basically, China is doing that on an international scale. From the perspective of, what the fuck is this? Dude, what are you sending me, man? China is capable of creating unbelievably low-cost alternatives with the with virtually every kind of good, and therefore, China has been able to gain a competitive edge and become the global manufacturing hub, and he who controls the entire globe's manufacturing controls the fate of the entire planet. This is what he's talking about when he says this is the second China shock, and it's terrifying.
Exactly. And Chinese exports, particularly in the years right after the pandemic, after the currencies depreciated, start growing at 2 times or 3 times the pace of world trade. So China's imports of autos used to be about 1 million cars a year. That's now down. It's now under 500,000 cars a year. And over this same period, China's exports of cars have gone from a little under 1 million to now 10 million in the space of 5 years. Just a stunning shift in a range of industrial sectors, and heavily industrial sectors that compete with Japan and compete with Europe. And so you sort of see bad economic performance in the manufacturing heart of Europe in particular, a little less so in the US.
So I think this point about the Europe versus U.S. is really interesting. And in one of the pieces you wrote about this, you wrote that the U.S. share of global output has been remarkably constant over the last 40 years. China's rise has come at the expense of the other G7 countries. Can you talk about what that looks like? I mean, I know let's use maybe Germany as an example.
I love watching liberals talk about this without identifying what the problem is, by the way. It is my favorite type of conversation, is my favorite type of back and forth, because at the end of the day, you just go back to, well, they're cheating because their system's design is better than ours. But they will never admit that, because then they would have to take the L on capitalism. Because that's what it comes down to. Like, they can say, oh, it's because initially these were low-cost labor sites because the Chinese labor force was much poorer overall. The Chinese conditions are much worse overall. Oh, they did this at gunpoint. They put nets outside of the Foxconn factories, whatever the fuck you want to call it, right? Like, oh, they were forcing people to do this. Idle hands go starving. But at the end of the day, the reason why China was able to develop is because of how they redistributed the foreign capital that was flowing into the country. And now they've developed to a degree where they are able to compete with the rest of the world. They're able to move their weight around. I will say it's, not lost on me that virtually all of the liberals who used to say China's going to fail next year, China's collapse is imminent, all those liberals are now making, China is actually dominating us style videos.
Germany didn't move as heavily into, kind of software platforms. They retained a more traditional manufacturing sector and focused on exports, including to China. So, Germany, after the global financial crisis, is exporting close to 3% of its GDP to China.
Hype train.
Manufactured goods.
Hype train
that
coming.
reflects the fact that Germany remained a very manufacturing-centric economy. The tunnel boring machines, the high-end sedans, a lot of fancy SUVs, also aircraft, the 320s made in Hamburg. All these industrial sectors tended to be industrial sectors which had a lot of overlap with China. And then you throw in the fact that the EV industry just took off in China. A lot of government support. And the German companies, they made their own efforts to make EVs in Europe, but those never took off globally.
Like, the reason why I don't think it's an apt comparison with predatory pricing that Amazon does with respect to China competing with other countries around the planet is because Amazon is destroying mom and pop shops that have to rely on the Amazon marketplace. America is also a equivalent competitor to Amazon at that point, right? That's why the analogy doesn't fully work. You can say, oh, China is actually, engaging in predatory pricing. They're artificially lowering their costs. We can't compete. They're destroying us. But we also have, objectively, throughout this period of Chinese development, have had far more power than China. Far more power than China. And still, to a certain degree, have far more power than China. We just destroyed ourselves. We destroyed our industrial base at the behest of capital. International capital, international parasitic capital that has no investment in national boundaries or its own people, its own neighbors, and the well-being of its labor force. Doesn't care. It's just for profit. Yeah, the United States is not a mom and pop shop, and China is the Amazon. It's not a great comparison for that reason. The United States has its own competitive Amazon-style platform, and China is also another Amazon-style platform, and is just destroying the major competitor. Hype Train is here, ladies and gentlemen. At level 10 Hype Train, we carry the flame. I haven't carried it in a couple days. We're at level 4 Hype Train right now.
In the way that China's EV industry has, and nor are they cost competitive. So what you see is German exports to China have fallen by about a percentage point of German GDP. And what was a strength, Germany benefited from selling to China right after the global financial crisis, became a weakness.
I want to focus in on another dimension of this. It's kind of inside the story you're telling, which is, so China Shock 1, it's lower on the value chain of manufactured goods. It's, clothes and consumer calculators and all these things that the story that was told was, we don't want these industries in the long run. What happens in the China Shock 2 is that China is starting to dominate industries on the technological frontier. I mean, you mentioned electric vehicles, you mentioned batteries, right? You could talk about solar panels. We could talk about, AI, where they're, basically neck and neck with us. How did they go from kind of low to mid-level manufacturing to the absolute frontier in batteries, solar, etc., that quickly?
There was certainly something in the air in China around manufacturing. The critical mass was built up and the foundations were laid. And I think it's a complicated story. So if you think about...
Honestly, this might be it for me. I'm tired of waiting around for Hasan. Like, I don't have anything better to do. Clearly, he doesn't respect our time. Why should we respect his? This is a mutual relationship as far as I'm concerned, but it's beginning to seem very one-sided. I think this is where I unfollow and unsub. 420 months, by the way. Thanks, everyone, but I can't take it anymore. Oh, God. We haven't seen Copy Pasta in the chat in a minute. You know what I mean? Paralyzed Pendant Plug. Thank you for the 25. Get the subs. Level 6 Hype Train. Ladies and gentlemen, at level 10, we will carry the freaking flame.
Electric vehicles being one of the famous sectors. What do you need to make an electric vehicle? Well, you actually need to be able to make a car. It is, a smartphone mixed with a car. So how does China learn how to make cars, good cars? Well, a lot of foreign companies come in, and Ford and GM and VW all had to partner with generally Chinese state companies to produce in China. That was just the rule. And they didn't have really much of a choice because China had a 25% auto.
Oh, I'm sorry. They didn't have much of a choice, you say. Well, there was one choice, which was to keep manufacturing at home. But no, our capital owners wanted to do everything in their power to depress wages. They wanted the cheap labor alternative that China offered. So they moved their manufacturing there. Sorry, but that's exactly what happened. That's exactly what took place. If you want to get mad at someone, get mad at capitalism. Get mad at the capital owners who made this decision. Why are we acting like capital owners these factories went to China at gunpoint? Like they were killing you if you don't go and move your factory to China and partner up with the government. No, it was part hubris and part greed. Okay? It was the greed of a low-cost labor alternative, and it was the hubris because they wanted to maximize profits. Again, like I said, labor, most malleable element of production. And it was part hubris, the hubris that these Chinese folk would never be able to make competitive products. Hubris, also known as racism, right? Oh, they're Chinese. They can never comprehend our brilliant Western minds. They would never, for years and years, they said, the Chinese products that they're making are dog shit. They're nowhere near as good as these superior Western quality products. Bro, some of us don't think it was very hubris. We literally lost our jobs. Dog, at what point do you think I'm making a sympathetic plea for the Warren Buffetts of the world here? Okay? Yes, I'm on your side on this story. Yes, that's what I'm describing. Unless you are a factory owner or a business owner, I'm not criticizing you. You're the worker. You lost your job. Industry moved away from your hometown. Here, I'll give you one example. Gary, Indiana. Gary, Indiana is a high black density town. Used to be a place where industry thrived. Gary, Indiana, factories closed down. Gary, Indiana is in a dire situation. Gary, Indiana, for the last 10 days has not had any electricity. Okay? United States of America. We're talking about the United States of America. There, for the last 10 days in Gary, Indiana, there has not been any electricity. Think about that. No power whatsoever. It's insane. We don't even talk about it in the news. That's what happened because the bosses wanted to ship manufacturing overseas because it was much more it was much more cost effective for them. They could justify sky high profits. And for years and years, consumers would in exchange for that would get cheaper consumer goods. And yes, Gary, Indiana, 85% black, which is why it's not being covered at all right now. Used to be a steel town, home to U.S. Steel's Gary Works, the largest steel mill complex in North America. That's Gary, Indiana. Now, it's devoid of power for 10 days, and it barely makes a blip on anybody's radar. Part of that is because it's experiencing abject poverty. Part of that is because it's very black. It's unfathomable. This is the wealthiest nation on the planet. That's why I say third world country with a Gucci belt. Big example. In 1979, GM domestically employed about 620,000 jobs. Now, GM employs about 150,000 employees worldwide. Wait, hubris was trying to make a joke? I thought you meant humorous and you ruined it. Wait, hubris means you think it's funny? What? No. Oh, I thought you misunderstood the word hubris, and that's why you were saying it. You were just making a joke and saying humorous. Got it.
Tariff, like for a very, very, very long time. So in order to, if VW's on the other side of the tariff with a JV partner.
You're talking about general outsourcing, but he's talking about how Chinese auto manufacturing, which he mentioned started with tariffs on imports in China that pushed those auto companies to manufacture. They're a good example of targeted tariffs.
They're going to have a big cost advantage. So GM had to also jump the tariff. Toyota had to jump the tariff. Everybody does the JVs, joint ventures. And then you want your parts suppliers to come and produce high quality parts. So they come to China. Well, guess what? They probably, once they learn how to make parts in China, they are making parts at a much lower cost.
Level 8 hype train.
It's relatively cheap. And you're starting to use those
never mind.
parts
Hype train died at level 7.
And China, and then local competitors spring up. So China ends up having world-class automotive parts production well before its companies suddenly master EVs. At a certain point, and China was they liked the results of the joint venture, but they didn't completely like the fact that for a while, most of the Chinese market was being met by auto market was being met by joint venture output. The indigenous Chinese-owned companies were not all that competitive. There was a sense that the auto manufacturers who had a JV were fat and lazy because they were too happy producing through their JVs. So there was a sense that, okay, well, this sector was still a little too foreign dominated. And then there was a correct sense that, well, we should try to take advantage of the transition to EVs. So China, makes it a priority. When China makes something a priority, credit is available to local firms that want to enter the EV market. The state banking system gets mobilized. Local governments start throwing money at it. You get a lot of small companies springing up. China supports the development of an indigenous local battery industry. Then, Tesla's market entry is also viewed as significant. When Tesla enters,
So all I'm getting from this is that China is an op to American labor on the same level, if not greater than capital. Wait, what? No. What do you mean? There would be no manufacturing of competitive, like Chinese labor is only outsourced. Like Chinese labor is only an op because our capital owners brought the labor there or brought the manufacturing there. That's crazy. It's not their fault that they actually were able to develop with all the foreign capital coming in. They were experiencing abject poverty. They had extreme poverty. Yeah, they should have just kept that. They should have just been relegated to the peasant class. They should have never been able to develop. They should have never been a competitive labor force capable of precise manufacturing. Stuff that they did is the argument at that point. What matters now is how do we recreate our industrial base? The Chinese working class are not our enemies, chatter. China as a state is not even our enemy. If you want to understand who's responsible for this situation, look no further than those who own capital. Yeah, why would the Chinese state guarantee U.S. labor welfare? Why would the Chinese state think about anything other than other than improving the material conditions of their citizens? If you're going to get mad at someone, get mad at our state. If you're going to get mad at someone, get mad at our capital owners. Get mad at capitalism. That's why I always jokingly say, like, if you want to beat China, if that's like your goal, then you kind of have to be China. That's what I'm saying. Yes, American capital is collapsing while China will remain. I don't see a resolution for American labor. That's what I'm saying, is that we can't recreate our industrial base. It's all downhill for Americans no matter what. That's not true. I'll give you an example. For the last decade, we have been begging America to create a domestic manufacturing hub for solar panels. This was one of the major demands from the Green New Deal. And our animal reactionary corporate media and our right-wing Republican Party and many of the right-wing centrist Democrats aggressively postured against it. We had a decade. We had all the wealth on the planet. We could have just designed these goddamn factories. We could have made cheap solar panels. But we didn't do that. We talk about how, England blew a 13-colony lead. We blew complete global control. We didn't do it. Because solar is obviously antagonistic to the needs of the fossil fuel industry. So now we're heading down a climate disaster and also simultaneously have no foothold in the next generation of energy around the globe. Because at the end of the day, solar panels and renewable energy in general reduces reliance on fossil fuels. Our entire economy is also anchored around the petrodollar. And we had no investment whatsoever in diversifying our over-reliance on fossil fuel. So now when Iran shuts off the Strait of Hormuz, we have to dump into our strategic petroleum reserves. And our oil and gas industry is booming right now. Oh my God, their profits are doing so well. But are you doing well? No. We didn't build a robust manufacturing hub here for solar panels. Those could have been millions of new jobs, millions of forever jobs. So it's not like we don't have the opportunity, or we didn't have the opportunity. There's always a way to turn this around. It's just that, unfortunately, let's be real, we're too stupid. Like right now, as it stands, and I have hope that we can change the American trajectory, but we are too reactionary and too stupid to change it at the moment. Because people who see the writing on the wall, who are smart enough to recognize what changes are taking place around the globe, are constantly warning about the imminent crisis. But unfortunately, the majority is chock full of reactionary propaganda, and our sophisticated corporate media apparatus designs propaganda in a way to make those smart people, intelligent people, thoughtful people look crazy, look silly. The Green New Deal is the best example of this. Like the fear-mongering around the Green New Deal is the best example of this. We have a crisis in stupidity.
Not required to do a JV, but in order to qualify for Shanghai government local support, has to meet a lot of local content requirements. So a supply chain that serves Tesla can also serve others. And when China sets up their consumer subsidies, in order to qualify for that subsidy, the car initially had to be made in China. The battery had to be made in China. That supported not just the Chinese battery industry, but the Chinese-owned EV industry. And then you get the EVs kind of just taking off. And so all of a sudden, you just get an explosion, which has been built on a foundation from the migration of Western parts makers, copying, emulation, and then an awful lot of industrial policy.
So something people may have heard is this argument that China has overcapacity, that overcapacity is a crisis. This is sort of related maybe to trade imbalances. I don't think that makes a lot of intuitive sense. Like, why is it a problem if they produce more cars than they buy? So how would you describe what the overcapacity issue is?
To me, the most coherent way of defining the concern about Chinese overcapacity is a set of sectors where China produces more than its domestic market can absorb, and where globally China's adding capacity in a sector that in aggregate already has more capacity than there is global demand. So in batteries, for example, China's ability to make batteries is a multiple of current global demand. So there's just no scope for anyone else to enter the market. I think the concern in a sector like autos, where there is overcapacity globally, there are more auto factories in Europe and in the US with capacity than there is demand. So many factories are operating at low levels of capacity or being underused. And there's overcapacity in China. A lot of Chinese factories are not being fully used. And China is adding to its capacity. So China, has the ability to make 55 million cars, which is, well over a half, close to 2/3 of world demand. And that is growing. And so China's expansion necessarily means the exit of capacity elsewhere when there's already spare capacity. Now, you can say that's just the operation of a market. New entrants going to displace old capacity. But it does feel different when a closed market suddenly is adding capacity to an industrial sector where in aggregate there's plenty of capacity, and they're squeezing margins, squeezing production out of the rest of the world.
One thing I've heard people ask is, how is this different than America? America rises as a manufacturing juggernaut from being a much more modest economy, when the country is founded. It does, over time, displace great companies from other countries. It does lead to competition that, is harder for other countries. But I do think economically, America's rise is not in every respect, but
I mean, that is what happened. That is literally what happened. Accelerated by World War II as well. Especially because America, due to its distance from the conflict, was able to recover far better than the rest of the world did at the time, or far better than the rest of the competitive Western industries did. But yeah, that is a big part of it. That's a big part of why America was such a dominant force. He who controls manufacturing controls the world. I just don't understand how you look at key periods of time. Like, I like to point to America's war economy, and it's like post-World War II war economy, as the closest America's ever gotten to like full-blown Chinese-style central planning. That's what it was during the war. And even after that, there was still the residual impact of the central economy, the centralized economic planning. And that's part of the reason why we dominated. What is median strategies, fake posters? What do you want? Why do you keep spamming? I don't know what you're talking about. I don't care.
Broadly considered to have been win-win in a lot of ways. So what is different about the rise of America as a manufacturer, like the rise of Detroit, the rise of all these dimensions, from what China is doing?
So our story is much more one of industrial investment for our own rapidly growing internal market. And we only really become a big exporter after World War II when the world's on its back, and that doesn't last that long. China's industrial rise is much more tied to exporting, and it's a much bigger exporter than we ever were.
Yeah, I know. It's the one that had the Hong pole. It's the one that had the Karen Bass pole. I know.
For that brief period after World War II.
So one argument here is simply China is winning. They're outcompeting the world, pretty fair.
Interesting. It's got to be tough to say as a liberal. I don't know how much Ezra leaned into the China is going to implode any day now type narratives. I don't know if he did that himself, but many people on the liberal side for years said over and over again, China's economy is about to implode. China's economy is about to implode. China's economy. Any day now, on the verge of demise. Remember? What did we say? That's not the case. What did they say when we said that's not the case? Oh, you just love eating China's dick. Oh, you're a communist. You love Mao Zedong. You're wrong. And you will see, filthy commie. Enjoy your tofu dreg housing in ghost cities. And sewer lard based food substitutes. Enjoy it.
And square here. And if the world doesn't like it, it needs to build better cars, build cheaper solar panels, create stronger supply chains. All this talk of China shocks and a China problem.
Not sewer lard, gutter oil, whatever.
It's just kind of a way to whine and keep China down. And that there's no problem here. Like, it would be great to have cheap Chinese electric vehicles. It's good for the world and the climate transition to have cheap Chinese solar panels. How do you take that argument?
Look, if your only goal is maximizing benefits to consumers in the short run, you should certainly import Chinese EVs, Chinese solar. Why not? Open economics say buy from whoever is cheaper, and then the competition will raise everyone else up. I think that misses a few things. One, it misses the shock that happens to our economies if traditional, even like traditional but still kind of cutting edge sectors disappear. China could supply, out of capacity that it has already built, the entire European auto market. All of it. 10 million cars. No problem. That's just giant compared to the global market. If an industry suddenly goes away, you have all the China Shock 1.0 type effects. Communities that grew up around building cars will just kind of disappear. Now, in the China Shock 2.0, you're not going to be moving to an export sector because no one's exporting to China. So you're going to move to necessarily a services sector. So you're going to become less focused on producing traded goods. Now, you might say,
I mean, that already happened. So he's just basically saying America is going to be even more service sector oriented.
Who cares? On the other hand, in Europe, an awful lot of research and development, an awful lot of innovation actually has emerged out of their automotive sector. So it's not clear these people are going to jump to a more innovative sector. They may jump to less innovative, less well-paid sectors. And in the interim, your economy is gonna suffer. And then I think there's a sense that people have discovered that supply chain dependence can be weaponized. China dominates magnets, rare earths. If you want those magnets, you want those rare earths, you better not tire off China. You better say nice things about China. You better not you better not do what Japan did and say you're going to come to Taiwan's defense if something were to happen. You kind of need to respect China.
It's so funny that they're coming to terms with the fact that China is a superpower. Like, this conversation is basically the bargaining stage of liberals recognizing China's place around the globe as a superpower that is not only competitive with the United States, but actually outcompeting the United States and perhaps maybe even the hegemon, the future hegemon. Like, because everything that they're talking about with respect to like Chinese, with respect to Chinese soft power, with respect to like, what you have to do because China has so much power now is like, yeah, this is what the United States did for the last 100 years, okay? Not 100, but almost 100 years. For the last century or so, almost a century, this is what the United States did. I mean, even down to like Afghanistan, Iraq, you think if another country were to behave that way, that the rest of the world wouldn't react? Look at Russia. Russia is doing America shit in Ukraine. Look at the reaction from the rest of the globe to Vladimir Putin. Look at the reaction from the rest of the world to Russia itself. If Russia didn't have China in its corner right now, and if it wasn't a major energy provider itself, it would be destroyed. So why is it that America gets to do that kind of stuff, but Russia can't? Well, because America was the hegemon for the longest time. And America still has tremendous power at its disposal. The SWIFT system, the petrodollar, these are things that are withering away, partially due to this administration's acceleration, this administration's incompetence. But the reality of the matter is, yes, China is a major power, and therefore we have to treat it as a major power. We can't just say, no, we get to do whatever we want, and you can't do anything about it. I would go so far as to say that we are very fortunate that they are not doing to us what we've done to the rest of the world. 100%. Okay? Can you imagine if China moved like America does? Like, at most, we complain because China's built like artificial islands, right? Oh, they take over coral reefs and they build artificial islands and they put military bases on it. Okay, that's in their backyard. We do that in their backyard. Okay? Like, people complain about the 9-dash line and how much China is just like dominating the South China Sea. Meanwhile, they have their own separate security cooperative agreements, with one exception, obviously Taiwan, and also the Philippines. But that's literally their backyard. At the end of the day, we do that to their backyard. Why the won't the Philippines do a separate security cooperative agreement with China? You think it's in their best interest? No, of course not. It's because we won't let them. So the point I'm trying to make is we should be thanking God every day that China, at least in this stage, this might change. I don't think they will, but we should be thanking God every day that they don't behave in the way that we do. Can you imagine doing joint military, Chinese Navy doing joint military exercises in Hawaii with Russia? Okay? Or with Mexico. Chinese Navy doing joint military exercise with the Canadian Navy or the Mexican Navy off the coast of California. That's what we do to them. Chinese naval exercise with the Cuban Navy off the coast of Miami, Florida. You know? What would we do? We'd lose our minds.
If you want access to their supply chain, that's kind of the argument that they are making. That kind of dependence scares people.
Like, imagine China greatly investing into a free Hawaii from colonialism campaign after years and years, like boosting, Polynesian, Samoan culture initiatives, like setting up NGOs in Hawaii for Polynesian culture, Samoan culture, and talking about restoring the Hawaiian kingdom, and then utilizing the global network of NGOs to say, it's really f***ed up how America has so many colonies, including Hawaii, technically. I'm not even talking about Guam. Before we get to Hawaii, there's Guam. There's obviously military bases all around the world. Puerto Rico, Radio Free Polynesia, Radio Free Puerto Rico, NGOs that they design, liberation movements or separatist movements that they arm, right? Like, there's so much that China could be doing that they don't do. Like a free Tibet, but for Puerto Rico. You know what I mean? Free Tibet, but Hawaii. Fuck it, free Tibet for Mexico, for Texas. That's an even more apt comparison. Free Texas. Texas is Mexican. California is Mexican. I mean, I wouldn't hate the California one, honestly. I would love to exist under the complete control of my glorious queen, Claudia Scheinbaum, but...
Finally, I would just say, look, if you want to emulate China, if you admire China, you want to emulate, you like the way China's electric vehicle industry has developed. It did not develop just...
Doesn't Chinese poverty start to look a little worse in the U.S. when you use U.S. poverty standards, even after accounting for Chinese subsidization? Yes, China is still objectively a much poorer nation than the United States of America. This is true. But you have to look at their living circumstances. There's like still very poor areas. Holy shit. IMEU, YouGov poll, they leaked it. I thought that they were going to make this poll revelation on my stream. But I guess they leaked it already. This was going to happen next week, but I guess they released it ahead of time. I will be talking to someone from IMEU. Percentage who say Israel's committing a genocide against Palestinians: Michigan 80%, Nevada 78%, New Hampshire 78%, New Mexico 76%, Virginia 72%, South Carolina 57%.
By throwing the doors open. It did not develop without industrial policy. China's EV industry developed behind some of the highest tariffs in the world at the time, 25%. Huge local preference. Chinese-made battery, ideally from a Chinese company. Chinese-made car, could be a Tesla, but it can be Tesla made in China with 90% Chinese content. And then an awful lot of local government support. There are stories of entire factories being built, not by the company, but by the local government, to the specifications of the company. So there's a story of protection and industrial policy that leads to the creation of this sector. You throw your doors open to China, you're going to get the cheap cars, but you're not going to get the EV industry. And I think many countries are reluctant to just cede more industrial ground to China.
So for a long time, the critique that you heard in American trade debate most often of China is that they were a currency manipulator. Then you stopped hearing that as much. I think your view is that has actually become a bigger part of the story again. So let's do this in two parts. What is currency manipulation? Why does it matter? And then what has been the sort of roller coaster, or where are we on the roller coaster of Chinese currency manipulation?
Sometimes currency manipulation is just like a currency whose value we don't like, which is, I think, how the president sometimes used to use it. He hasn't been talking as much about it. But the more accurate way of defining it would be a country that has an undervalued currency. You can quantify that. And so you look for...
Genuine question, as a fellow train lover, how do you deal with the contradiction when China wants to export cheap cars everywhere but will lead to more car-centric infrastructure because it's so cheap? What are you talking about? China literally has high-speed rail. China, in many respects, is very similar to America, except much better in terms of its public transport alternatives. Yeah, they got trains too, buddy. They could export cheap train cars as well. Or, fuck it, we could make them here. I know we forgot about this, you know? It's like, oh, we can't go back to the moon. The scientists forgot how to get there, you know? We lost the ancient recipes. But, like, we kind of didn't lose the ancient recipes. We could just make this shit here, you know? I wish.
Or a surplus that's bigger than you would expect given the underlying characteristics of the economy. Factor one. And factor two is government or quasi-government intervention in the foreign currency market. So it's not just the outcome of differences in monetary policy. There's a government with its finger on the FX market, buying currency to hold the currency down. China met both of those definitions unambiguously from 2003 to 2012. There was a political decision not to call them a manipulator. Now, during the latter part of their period, they're letting their currency appreciate. So they're kind of correcting the undervaluation, which is part of the reason why they weren't named. China is now back through its state banks buying a lot of foreign currency in the market, $50 billion a month, $600 billion a year. So there's a much clearer case that China is manipulating now than there was in the past. Trump hasn't taken interest in this. The Europeans, though, have. And so I think what you're seeing is that this becomes shifting from being an American debate to being a global debate.
When we were preparing for this conversation, something I found myself thinking about a lot was the question of whether or not it matters if the competition is fair. Mm-hmm. I'd say for a long time, the narrative that at least we were comfortable with in this was a very procedural narrative about China betraying the principles of free trade. They are a currency manipulator who is keeping their currency artificially cheap in order to make their exports cheaper. Or, you know, they're doing all these industrial subsidies, and are you really supposed to do those under the World Trade Organization? And it's a very sort of liberals who believe in the system way of thinking about the problem, that the problem is China is cheating. And I'm not saying cheating can't be a problem, but there's clearly quite a few places now where China is just winning, or they've got into a place where they can win. And so I guess my question is the problem that some of China's advantages are unfair, right? They're back to currency manipulation, their currency seems artificially cheap. Or is just the problem that from a national interest perspective, from an interdependence and weaponization perspective, that, you know, Germany, Europe, the United States, it would be a mistake to just allow their industries to get wiped out? That the question here is not an abstract commitment to free trade. It is what creates a kind of healthy national ecosystem.
Look, I increasingly lean towards we just want these kinds of industries. We don't want full-on dependence. We don't have to rely on arguments about procedural violation of rules, which feel a bit dated in a world where we ourselves are clearly not following the most basic of the rules. And, you know, the rules have a lot of complexity. You're allowed to subsidize under the rules. You're not supposed to subsidize if it's to substitute for imports. Well, if you subsidize a sector and everything in that sector previously was imported, are you import substituting or are you just subsidizing that sector? Is a government-guided fund that puts money into private equity funds and venture funds to invest in chip manufacturing, is that a subsidy? yes and no. It may not be a subsidy under the rules. So the rules themselves are contested and not uniformly followed. And to some degree, in certain sectors, I think we care much more about outcomes than about the rules. That's obvious in sectors of national security importance. So a lot of the rare earths, famous sector, have very, very direct and important military applications. We should probably not, even if China played completely fairly, want to be 100% dependent on China for the supplies of those key materials. And then you kind of have to work further from that. Where does the line come about what do you care about? Where do you just care about the outcome? And where are you going to rely more on arguments around procedural fairness? And then I think on the flip side, China itself clearly cared about the outcome, not the procedural fairness.
What would you say the Trump administration, across its 2 terms, and I realize they've been different in important ways, has gotten right about China? I mean, if Trump has been disruptive on how America has thought about anything, it has been China. And what do you think they've gotten wrong in their either China orientation or their China policy?
There is something a little strange about Trump's first term, because the first term, 2017, 2018, it's like the U.S. political system reacted to the China shock 5 to 10 years after the first China shock happened. So the timing was maybe strange, but a lot of the policy direction, I would agree, was more or less right. I think it was right to broadly say that the WTO rules, which were thought to be constraining China, had become a constraint on ourselves. China was really good at finding ways of achieving outcomes by living on the edge of the rules. I think the targeted first wave of tariffs were actually sort of in sectors where it was reasonable, generally speaking, to have tariffs.
And you're talking here in the first term?
First term, yeah. So like in the first term, the tariffs were basically on China. In the second term, the tariffs were basically on everyone. And I am much more comfortable with putting tariffs on China, particularly now because, China's economy.
Trade protectionism only works if you have trade to protect. I am not a free marketeer. I never have been, and I never will be. Okay? But if you were to actually do trade protectionism, you have to ensure that you have some kind of trade to protect. This is why, as much as I would love low-cost and beautifully designed Chinese electric vehicles, I understand why America engages in broad tariffs against such things to stop them from entering the American market so that we have some semblance of an automobile industry. The problem is free market is bullshit. It's not real, right? Obviously, America's never abided by that standard. There's no such thing as fairness in capitalism. It doesn't work that way. But what's frustrating about this is we don't even have any industry, man. We don't have any industry. We cannot, because it's at this stage, without a command economy, without central planning, we will never be able to keep up with China. It will forever remain the global manufacturing hub of the planet, and it will only grow in its power, and it will do whatever the it wants to as we slowly but surely continue experiencing more Gary Indiana-style situations all around the country. And now China's already moved into the realm of entertainment as well. They're going to start dominating us there too. There's just no way to solve this problem without solving capitalism, without fixing capitalism. As long as capitalism remains, as long as capital is the domineering force, we will never be able to compete against China. We will never be able to do anything. It's that simple. Second thought video on China too.
Okay.
China is beating the US by every metric. And when we say that, you know what's crazy, by the way? You know what's really frustrating about all this? They never stop yelling at us for being right but too early. People never stop yelling about the fact that we were just right all along about China. Now they're coming to that conclusion, but they won't stop. They won't stop punishing us from being right. They won't stop punishing us for being right but too early. Like, oh, dude, how dare you? When I was saying China was on the verge of collapse and you were telling me no, and I yelled at you and said you're a CCP dick rider, you love Mao Zedong. Well, guess what? You were right about that. I'm arriving at that conclusion now, but you anyway. It's like, dude, well, if you recognize that now, if you recognize my conclusions now, then you have to yeah, dog, I know you like collars. Yeah, this shirt is crazy. It's a Yoji Yamamoto shirt. Got collars upon collars. But my point is, then listen to my warning now. Not that you ever will. No one ever will. Everyone's like, oh, you're a dummy. You're a stupid socialist. You. But
economy has shifted dramatically and become much more export-oriented, much more of a competitive threat now than it was then.
I've never understood what to do with these collars, by the way. Because, like, you got the normal collar here. Yeah, the Japanese have gone crazy. They put collars on collars. You got the normal collar here. And then you got you have two additional collars here. And they got buttons on them as well. And I have no idea what the you're supposed to do with it. You can double pop it if you want. Bro, you got to flip the inner one up. I mean, it's not like strong enough. It's not hard enough to stay in place. You know what I mean? It's in the lookbook. I've never seen it. I've never seen the lookbook. Undo the top button. Why? You only double pop if you stack them. They're designed to be stacked. Anyway, let's continue with this.
So I think Trump 1 got that bit right. Like Bob Lighthizer, the United States Trade Representative in Trump's first term, was sort of the first step of moving us from the WTO consensus to a world of reciprocal interdependence, supply chain vulnerability, supply chain warfare, concerns about a world where everything is using a more militarized vocabulary.
The whole world is rooting for Iran. What is it? I've been stunned by the many number of officials from a wide variety of countries who, while hardly favoring Iran or feeling much empathy for the Islamic Republic, have privately expressed to me a huge sigh of relief over Tehran's success in thwarting the U.S.-Israeli aggression. Yeah. I mean, it makes total sense. America is a behemoth. America's a behemoth. Us receiving a bloody nose in the Strait of Hormuz is a good thing for us as well. Okay? It's good for us as Americans. If it forces American restraint and it forces us to recalculate how we operate, then it's good. An important point by Eli Clifton and Ian Lustig. The biggest cost of the U.S.-Israel relationship is not in dollars, but in opportunity cost and path dependency. In other words, closing off America's freedom of action. It's not just good for the rest of the world if we are no longer this towering behemoth that's dominating the rest of the planet at a moment's notice, whenever we feel like it, but it's actually good for us in general. It's good for Americans as well. Because the current modus operandi for the United States is not beneficial for the rest of the world. It's certainly not beneficial for them, but it's not beneficial for those who are living in the United States either. You know? We don't get to see any of the benefits anyway. Bullshit.
Even around economic exchange. Trump 1 was still pretty unilateral. There was a famous story, I think, in another newspaper where, President Macron asked, like, well, maybe we should negotiate something together. So they're negotiating phase 1, the deal. And President Trump was like, no. We've done the tariffs. All the benefits should go to us. This has to flow to us. And so there was an element in the first term of unilateralism, which obviously becomes unilateralism on steroids over time.
So maybe before then we get to Trump 2, it's worth talking about Biden.
Yeah.
Because, there's a lot of Democratic criticism of the way Trump talks about China, to some degree of Trump's tariffs on China. But the Biden team comes in. They largely keep the tariffs. In some cases, expand them into new areas. They begin doing more to limit the export of what they consider to be strategically important technologies like advanced chips to China. They put on higher tariffs on EVs, and they do a lot of industrial policy that actually looks sort of like the way you're describing Chinese industrial policy. So the Inflation Reduction Act is trying to build a domestic...
See, this is bullshit. No disrespect to Ezra, but this does not hold a candle to Chinese industrial policy. That is crazy. Okay? No, it shows the limitations of capitalism. This is 100% a clear-cut, demonstrable limitation of liberal capitalism. Those move mountains, dude. Sometimes literally, like sometimes figuratively, but sometimes literally, many times literally. They move cities, they move mountains. They have 5-year plans. They have growth targets in specific sectors, and they deploy the flows of capital in that direction. Okay? It is ridiculous. The idea that like the CHIPS Act or the IRA or Build Back Better it can hold a candle to that kind of mass scale industrial planning is ridiculous. And therein lies the problem. That's why I always say, like, if in order to beat China, if we want to compete against China and beat China, whatever that means, we have to be China.
Supply chain for things like solar panels and wind turbines. And now they're more okay with it being, in friendly countries too. But there's a lot of Buy American standards on all of this. And they begin talking a lot in terms of strategic technological competition. AI is a big thing for them in the AI competition with China. How do you think about the way the Biden administration approached this and both kind of tweaked but didn't upend like the Trump 1 approach?
It probably, in my view at least, didn't go far enough. It wasn't just clean energy, although that was certainly a big focus. It also included semiconductors. Mm-hmm. And in semiconductors, at the time, the concern was dependence on Taiwan, which was vulnerable to pressure from China, certainly vulnerable, would put the U.S. in a difficult position if China were ever to put an embargo or attack Taiwan. And at a certain point, the U.S. just made a decision that we did not want China to have access to the world's best, certainly not the ability to make the world's best chips. Too many risks associated with that. I think that was the right decision, but it unambiguously was viewed by China as a directly hostile act. And I think if someone had done that to us, we would have viewed it as a directly hostile act. So it put us into a unambiguous world of rivalry and competition, and in a position where there is no way.
I think another part of the problem is like China is too resilient, and no matter what we do, they just keep winning. A lot of people will say, "Oh, do nothing, win," when they talk about Xi Jinping. It's like those are they're never doing nothing. They're always doing something. Like even with the chips, America went to the Netherlands and told them that the Netherlands which had the technology for the latest lithography machines that are necessary for chips production. Okay. We told the Netherlands you can't sell these to China. Okay. Well, then they went back to the drawing board and were able to make it themselves. They did. And while we thought we were stopping their productive capabilities, their production capabilities by at least a decade, they were able to move the timeline to a year. Yes, the EUV lithograph, is that how you say it? Like lithography? Is that? I don't know how you say it. It's just the machine, the extreme ultraviolet lithography, the machines that make the chips. Not the latest chips though, no. Dude, it doesn't matter. The fact that they are still like, they were able to buy the lower tier lithography machines and now they're capable of mass producing it means that the timeline has moved up dramatically. Lithography? Lithography? I don't know how you say it. Chip machine, man. I'm not smart enough, okay? I'm not a goddamn nerd. Yeah, then they write articles about how China built its Manhattan project to rival the West in AI chips. Shenzhen team completed a working prototype of an EUV machine in early 2025. The lithography machine, built by former ASML engineers, fills a factory floor, sources say. China's EUV machine is still undergoing testing and has not yet produced working chips. Government is targeting 2028 for working chips, but sources say 2030 is more likely. EUV is still far away. We need to stay humble. I mean, even this was unforeseeable. Okay? This was unexpected and unforeseeable. Can they produce consumer grade RAM, please? Yes, they will. And then the American government will make it illegal for you to purchase it. They'll come to your house and break down your door with masked ICE agents and arrest you for purchasing Chinese goods. They already are making RAM. And yes, it is much more affordable. If there's one thing that China always does, it is exceed their benchmarks, their targets. They end up accomplishing those tasks far before people predict them, and we consistently underestimate their capabilities.
China is not going to try to engineer us out of their chip supply chains. That's become a national priority. And so we are trying to reduce all our vulnerabilities to Chinese economic coercion at the same time. But it didn't really go far enough in critical minerals, rare earths. I mean, there was plenty of talk about it, but there wasn't enough action, not enough on active pharmaceutical ingredients, where either the medicine or the key chemical precursors are almost 100% sourced from China. So I think, it was a step in a necessary direction. It was controversial because of industrial strategy, industrial policy.
Yeah, we're number one in copium production. China will never catch up on that. That's true. Yeah, make no mistake. If there is a global force in copium production, in copious amounts of copium production, it is us. Okay? We're number one in copium.
Long time, the thought was that was something other countries did. It wasn't something that America did. And it wasn't something we're necessarily very good at. And in some cases...
And it's crazy because they didn't mass produce copium elsewhere and then feed it to the American population in the same way that opium destroyed the Chinese population. Which, by the way, love him or hate him, shouts out to Mao Zedong. They really nipped that shit in the bud. That was huge. One of the most successful rehabilitative recovery programs of all time. Like, historic improvements in that field. That was under Mao. Meanwhile, yeah, we're doing mass copium distribution, mass facilitation of copium. There's a real copium epidemic in America.
rare earths and the magnets like active ingredients.
Homegrown.
It means finding ways to incentivize production in sectors where you know you can't compete with China on cost.
So that then brings us to Trump 2.
Mm-hmm.
And so how would you rate what they have done and where it has hit the right balance and where it's been off?
So in general, I have noted on many times that I like Bob Lighthizer trade policy, i.e. Trump's first term, better than I like Donald Trump's trade policy, i.e. Trump's second term. Lighthizer was careful to only threaten things that the U.S. economy could sustain. So, the tariff level was set at 25%, which, people didn't like paying it, but you could afford to pay it. He didn't cover all of trade, so there was always a little more trade you could bring into that tariff. Trump had a theory of the case in his second term, which worked for most of the world, but didn't work for China. And the theory of the case is, well, trade's rigged against us. We need to raise our tariffs. And you need to lower your tariffs, lower your barriers to U.S. exports to put trade on a more fair footing. You shouldn't, in other words, retaliate for our...
Yeah, except what are they to buy? Like, what? Is there products that the Chinese population is like vying for that they simply cannot purchase? What is the product that America creates that, regular Chinese society is like, I really wish I had my hands on this shit. Okay. F-35s, I guess. Like, what is it? We make burger, porn, and tanks. Okay. We make guns, burger, porn, tanks. And when I say tanks, I don't mean like, literal weapons of war. I'm talking about the F-350. That's what I'm talking about. Like, what could we even sell to half of these goddamn countries? You know what I mean? Not even just China, but like, what could we sell? NFTs, dude? That's what we're going to sell to China? NFTs. Gambling. Our major growth sector of gambling and pornography. Why won't China purchase our gambling apps? Guns, small arms trafficking. Why won't China purchase Smith & Wesson weapons so they can give it to their citizens so people can shoot one another like we do? Why won't Cambodia purchase F-150s, a fleet? Why won't the UK purchase salmonella chicken? Why is nobody purchasing our goods? We want to sell them. Yeah. Fun fact, the U.S. sells weapons to one or more sides in about 2/3 of the world's active conflicts. Yeah, National Cattlemen Beef Association is mad. Trump is saying that they're going to import cattle now to allow the American cattle industry to grow its supply again, to improve the number of cattle that we have. National Cattlemen's Beef Association says no calf producer in America is asking for increased imports. Undercutting American farmers and ranchers with inferior product from foreign competitors is nothing to create market confidence or encourage rebuilding the herd. We're also killing live horses. Yeah, I've heard wild horses. Yeah. We're eradicating the wild horses. Hassan, do not show to Navy Hasanabi heads. What is this?
Ethos. On the Shandong, the morale of the crew is heavily influenced by the quality of food and drinks provided.
Stop.
Well, they're not your average cooks. These folks are highly skilled chefs, probably the kind you'd find in fancy restaurants.
Stop.
They've got the expertise to whip up delicious meals without any Gordon Ramsay-style drama. But it's not just about taste. The menu is carefully planned to ensure the crew gets the right mix of nutrition and calories. They focus on fiber and protein over fat, keeping everyone in top shape. And get this, they offer 7 meals a day. Yep, you heard that right.
What?
This variety accommodates the crew's different schedules and dietary needs, making sure everyone gets what they need.
Bro, sources on the ground told me that there were some people on USS Lincoln that watched this video, and that's the reason why they tried to kill themselves. Yeah. Sources on the ground. Sources at USS Lincoln are reporting that this video was distributed amongst the regular ranks, and as soon as they watch it, they try to jump off the top of the ship
when they need it. And here's the clever part. Spreading out the meal times prevents long lines and keeps the kitchen running smoothly. After all, you don't want half the ship waiting in line for food at the same time. It's all about efficiency here. One standout dish aboard China's aircraft carriers is the carrier chili sauce, known for its robust flavor and reported nutritional value. It's a crew favorite, although some find it best enjoyed with rice due to its intense heat. Made from basic ingredients like beef mince, chili pepper.
This is why you're so low on the fact meter on the media bias chart. Why? Because I'm making a joke. Is it legal for Americans to join their army? Oh.
Black beans, garlic, and chicken essence. It's especially popular among crew members on night shifts, as it helps stave off fatigue. On board, there's a convenient supermarket offering a variety of everyday.
Did I just see Starbucks? Wait, stop.
On board,
bro, they're eating Doritos on their aircraft carriers. They're still selling Doritos.
There's
and
a convenient
Starbucks
supermarket
coffee. What
offering
the
a
fuck?
variety of everyday items, personal hygiene products.
I guess that's one complete cultural victory. I guess we got that. We got our treats still.
And food at reasonable prices. While the crew gets their meals for free, they can purchase additional snacks or other items here if they wish. The Shandong features a library stocked with plenty of non-fiction books, offering crew members the chance to explore topics of interest during their downtime. For instance, there's a book titled The History of the War of Resistance Against America and Reinforcement of the Korean Peninsula, focusing on the Korean War. In their leisure time, sailors can also relax in recreational rooms, where they can indulge in activities like playing video games, watching TV, or connecting with loved ones on social media. While off-duty life is relatively independent, on-duty hours are characterized by social collaboration.
So funny. Our U.S. Navy sailors don't know how to read, man. All right. Enough with this video. What the fuck are we doing, man? What are we doing?
Tariffs. China retaliated. China said this is coercive. Plus, China knew they were going to be in the crosshairs. She did a good job of getting ready. He'd spent 4 years plotting this out. So China retaliates. We counter-retaliate. China retaliates some more. We retaliate again, and we push tariffs up to 145%. You might think that gives us more leverage. We've completely cut off trade. It turned out to be the opposite. Our economy couldn't sustain 145% tariffs on pretty much everything coming from China. So the administration was in a position where they needed to negotiate a rollback in the tariffs. There's a rare earths component as well. But
where China was holding back rare earths, which would cripple our manufacturing.
Yeah, so that was real. Mm-hmm. But I think even if China had not done that, even without the supply chain restrictions, the administration knew it needed to roll back the 145% tariffs.
Yeah, okay. Well, what now, libtard? One U.S. Army unit is offering 4 bonus days off to play Grand Theft Auto for soldiers who re-enlist. That's right. How about that, dude? How about that? And they get free HRT. They get free TRT. Abysmal. American military supremacy is so dead. Yeah, they need to commit to 2 years minimum to get the Grand Theft Auto time off, dude. It's crazy. Morale problems. What morale problems? Yeah, if you want... yeah, you get 4 paid days off if you re-enlist so you can die for Israel. Sick. That's awesome. Yeah, what now, dude? I bet China doesn't have provisions like that.
The example that I like to give is that in the summer of Trump's first year with 100-ish plus tariffs, all the retailers who import artificial Christmas trees, which like all come from China. Think Christmas tree ornaments, think holidays. Well, those are things that are actually typically imported during the summer. Now, if you're paying 150% tariff, you're going to have to triple whatever your retail price or something crazy. And the Christmas tree importers weren't sure, because they're building up inventory ahead of a future sale, that American consumers would be willing to pay that higher price. So they just stopped importing. And, when there's a hole, and there are other places where companies were having to pay that price for a part, and that would render their ability to export utterly uncompetitive. So it was too broad, too high, too fast. It was disrupting the U.S. economy. That was a mistake. And I think Lighthizer, in his first term, got it closer to right. Don't ever escalate to the point where you're put on tariffs that you aren't willing to maintain. The other side will realize that you are looking for a face-saving way to pull things back. That was, I would say, mistake one. Mistake two was the breadth of the tariffs. Not targeted reasonably by countries. Just everyone got hit with the Liberation Day tariffs, in some cases very, very, very high tariffs. That alienated a bunch of countries that themselves were worried about trade with China. So it kind of took away the possibility of building a broader coalition against China. So that's first problem with these very, very broad tariffs. Second problem with the very, very broad tariffs was that they ended up being done in kind of irrational, to my mind, ways. We were tariffing at really high levels Canadian aluminum. All right. Canadian aluminum is, not that this administration cares, but it's made in a kind of green way, trapped hydropower in Quebec. It has been part of our aluminum industry since World War II, when the bombers were built with Canadian aluminum. There is no national security threat. It is essential to our market. The primary aluminum market doesn't clear in the U.S. without Canadian imports, which meant that just prices shot up. And then the final problem was like, hey, aluminum is electricity distilled, incredibly energy intensive and electricity intensive. So it is competing with data centers for power. And so even with the really high tariffs.
This guy's anti-China though, right? Yes, but he's also basically describing or at least recognizing China's rise in global prominence, China's rise to power, and its impact on the American economy. But they're at least like enlightened liberals who recognize the downsides, but they can't identify how it happened, I guess. Because they're still giving credit to like Trump's they're basically giving credit, or he's basically giving credit to Donald Trump recognizing the dangers of China before other Americans moved, like before other electeds moved in that direction, which I think is silly because they're also refusing to understand why China's rise happened. And if you can't comprehend why China's rise happened, if you just simply think, oh, well, they just one day they just got really good at making shit because we sent our manufacturing over there, and that's it. And there's nothing we can do about it. Then you're never going to be able to solve the problem. And there's a good deal of like they're cheating in this conversation as well. It's not as bad as I thought it would be, though. Mark Lynch wrote on Foreign Affairs, The End of the American Middle East. Here's Truda reporting on us first, or looking at the first opening paragraph. The American Middle East is finished. The regional order that has prevailed since 1991 has been one that many casualties of the U.S.-Israeli war with Iran. The American and Israeli failure to dislodge the regime in Tehran has proved the bankruptcy of the decades of sanctions and violence. More and more Americans are now coming to terms with this reality, which I really appreciate. But what will we do next is what matters most. And I don't think that Americans are going to wake up to this reality and then instead change our trajectory, change course. I suspect we're just going to double down. U.S. 30-year treasuries erase gains from buyback announcement. Scott Besson, who made his billions helping Soros break currencies in the 1990s, should recognize what this sort of intervention failure signals. So now this is exactly the opposite message we've been getting from Warsh, who says the market price is a useful signal and that traders should be playing ball. Besson says buybacks could be bigger than the $4 billion we announced. And now he's saying U.S. yields don't reflect underlying fundamentals. It has been kind of funny watching so many of these liberals, though, who spent a good deal of time talking about China's imminent decline, imminent demise, turn around and be like, why is China such a behemoth? Anyway, let's look at this fixer Michael Cohen now. We're moving
one
on
of his most...
Hasan Reaction is one of the best ones in the React channel.